All right, listeners, I think you know that we are part of the Radiotopia network, which is basically a network built on the idea that you should support the most creative, independent audio makers around. No one, and I mean no one, embodies the Radiotopia ethos more than Benjamin Walker and his show Theory of Everything. Benjamin, who I've known for a long time, has been making beautiful, personal, sprawling audio documentaries for decades that help us understand the very strange world we live in. And now he has a new series called Not All Propaganda is Art. The new series goes back to the 1950s, when Western security agencies like the CIA paid artists, writers, and intellectuals to fight the cultural Cold War.
The CIA funds were free. I mean, no one was told what to say.
Gloria Steinem, activist who sees the CIA as a sort of enlightened pal or rich uncle, there is another viewpoint.
Look, if you're listening to this show, I know you like secret histories. I know you like a mix of culture and politics and shadowy figures. So what are you waiting for? Not All Propaganda is Art from Benjamin Walker. You can find it now wherever you listen or at theoryofeverythingpodcast.com. This day is brought to you by Progressive. Are you driving your car or doing laundry right now? Podcasts go best when they're bundled with another activity. Kind of like Progressive home and auto policies. They're best when bundled too. Having those two policies together makes insurance easier and could help you save. Customers who save by switching their home and car insurance to Progressive save nearly $800 on average. Quote a home and car bundle today at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. National average 12-month savings of $793 by new customers surveyed who saved with Progressive between June 2021 and May 2022. Potential savings will vary. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avergan. This day, March 13th, 1916, 6,000 American troops are preparing to enter Mexico after being ordered there by President Woodrow Wilson to capture Pancho Villa. Wilson proclaimed that the troops were there to, quote, have the single objective of capturing him and putting a stop to his forays. Forays is kind of a good word for what the U.S. was up to as well, because this was sort of an era where the U.S. was being, I don't know, what's the right word? Adventurous? A little meddlesome in Mexican politics. We'll go through some of this backstory and, of course, what Pancho Villa was up to. But, the U.S. had basically backed and unbacked a whole series of different leaders within Mexico around this era, including Pancho Villa himself. So, here to discuss the hunt for Pancho Villa, American relations and interference with Mexico, which is fighting for its independence around this era, and lots more, are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Columbia and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
And I should say, if I sound different, I'm in a hotel room in Los Angeles recording this podcast. Last time I did this, I'm only going out of my way to say this because last time I did this, I got a bunch of emails from people being like, you sound different, what's going on? It was like a real, what's that, who moved my cheese moment? It was just like, something sounds off. But anyway.
It's an outpouring of concern.
Yeah.
Yes.
Are you safe? Check in.
Blink twice on your podcast.
I know.
It's just a different microphone that's a little easier to put into my carry-on bag. That is all. Anyway, where do we start? I mean, I think the important context here, and it gets to sort of bigger sense of what Pancho Villa's role is in all of this. But, a week earlier, there had been a raid from Pancho Villa into what is now known as New Mexico. And so there's this series of incursions across the border. Any thoughts on that and kind of why Wilson gets to this place where he says, all right, enough, I'm sending in some troops?
At least part of it is because U.S. citizens were being killed in these raids, right? They weren't like just crossing the border, but it was crossing the border and launching these low-level attacks. And that in and of itself might be a small thing, but Pancho Villa was not just a random person from Mexico who was crossing the border and leading these raids. He was part of, I don't know if you want to call it a rebellion or a civil war or a lot of unrest in Mexico over the course of the 19-teens. And so there was a sort of foreign affairs or international leadership dimension to this, and the U.S. felt it had a role to play in that.
Yeah, in January of 1916, there's a train in Mexico in which Americans are on board, and he pretty much kidnaps 18 of those Americans, and then he slaughters them. He kills all of them. And so there has to be some sort of recourse on the side of the United States to respond to this, because people are terrified that if you're American and you go into Mexico, that you could be, the next victim of one of these rebel leaders.
Yeah.
And Villa does that in response to what he sees as a strike from the Wilson administration. So, there had been a number of shifts in leadership in Mexico over the course of a few different years. And at one point, Wilson had been backing Villa as a potential new leader of the country of Mexico. And then Wilson decides he kind of likes the new president and withdraws his support from Villa. And Villa's like, okay, you withdraw your support, I'm going to kill a bunch of Americans. And that's how this begins.
Yeah. I mean, this is such a reminder. We've talked about it a few times on this show, but like when you think about U.S. involvement in other countries, you have to start with what are the internal dynamics in that country. There's almost always, I feel like the main thing that dictates. And so here we have Villa fighting, mostly what he sees as internal battles coming off of a bloody civil war that ended, just a couple years earlier. And then you have Venustiano Carranza, who becomes the president, and then they're fighting. And then, the U.S. time and time again sort of sticks its nose into something, doesn't maybe understand the internal dynamics. And that's where it gets messy and complicated. But, we often, of course, see it through a U.S. lens and just think about the U.S. and their dynamic. And it's more like the dynamic within a country is really the important thing. That said, it's also important to remember that this is a moment where that border is fluid and contested, and there are these raids going across the border and American citizens on the border. You read the history of this, and it's just like every couple of weeks, it's like 30 people were killed here, 30 people were killed there, a raid here, a raid there.
And we should also say that, we covered this maybe a year ago or last year on the podcast with the U.S. occupation of Haiti with Jelani Cobb. But this is a moment, like just a year before this, President Wilson sends in troops to Haiti, and they stay for decades. And so the fact that he's using military force in another country and sending in troops, there's no real clarity about how many troops he will send, how long those troops will be there, what is necessary in order to be successful in this engagement. And so this moment or this era of sort of imperialism is just rife.
If you remember that moment when Haiti, they went and rewrote the Constitution, literally just said, here's your new Constitution.
It's such a fascinating moment because the U.S. has seen the Western Hemisphere as its sphere of influence for a century by this point. But with this new age of imperialism that had just really started as the U.S. starts picking up colonies and territories that it does not plan to integrate into the United States just at the turn of the century, now there's more force behind it. There's more of a military angle to it. And it's happening at the same moment. This is 1916. A year later, Wilson is going to go to bat for this idea of national self-determination as the main idea governing international affairs. But here he is. He's like, well, I don't like that leader of Mexico. Why don't we try this guy? Oh, no,
national
actually, I don't
self-determination
like
for some people. Yeah.
I know.
Right.
And I mean, it's a little flip, but I mean, you read this and you just get this sense of the U.S. coming into its own as a country and then having kind of these colonial ambitions, and maybe Wilson saying, well, if England gets to go meddle in India and Africa and all these other places, what's our that? Okay, well, there's Haiti and there's Mexico. It really does just feel like textbook colonial behavior.
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting because it's textbook also when it's show of force. So sending in 6,000 troops, they're sending in trucks, airplanes, ample supplies. The terrain in Mexico is really rough. So invading doesn't just take place very easily. There are certain roads that just don't exist. So they have to create those roads in order to get to higher ground, to seek out Villa and all of his men. And it becomes a much more complicated affair than I think anyone anticipated. And so the price tag on this obviously goes up.
And the other sort of colonial feature of this is that the U.S. does ask permission to invade Mexico to hunt down Pancho Villa, right? They ask the president. The president reluctantly agrees to this. I think better to give permission than to be invaded by force. But as Kellie was saying, then it turns into this, what did you call it in the introduction, Jody? An adventure, a meddling
adventure, excursion. Well,
a foray. It was many forays.
A foray, yeah. Well, and funnily enough, I mean, one little tidbit here. The actual name of this effort was the Punitive Expedition. So, sometimes it's like the thing that you name yourself tells you a lot about how you view yourself. And so if it's like they were calling this the Punitive Expedition. So, yes. Let's go back to it a little bit. Yes, it was logistically, it was a nightmare, as we were saying. They spent tons of money. They were trying to send new trucks and airplanes, and supply lines were all screwed up and so forth. I suppose one thing is that this actually, because of who was running this expedition, it probably taught the U.S. some important lessons. So the man behind who was charged with leading this expedition was a General John J. Pershing. And that name, I think a lot of people probably know, went on to be a World War I hero, and really kind of developed a lot of the U.S.'s foundational military tactics during World War I. And I think probably learned some hard lessons about logistics and supply lines and all that stuff from this expedition.
Yeah, I mean, they're sending out long-range patrols. So small groups of men that are going up into the mountains, up into the hills, trying to find these rebels. Skirmishes take place in which 17 American soldiers are killed, and then another 38 Mexicans die. So these aren't huge numbers, but at the same time, it's not nothing either. I mean, there are battling actively trying to get to Villa. And with each skirmish, it seems like there's always a setback and never enough success to really complete the mission.
Right.
And by the end of all of this, they end up killing 203 members of Villa's band of supporters. They wound another 108, and that's more than half of the people. He had almost 500 people who were supporting him. The U.S. manages a kind of war of attrition against Villa and his supporters. They never capture Pancho Villa. Yeah. I mean, they are punitive, and they manage to keep Villa from ever raiding the U.S. border again, but they don't actually complete their mission.
Yeah. And Carranza, who's the president at this point, basically withdraws his support of the mission and tells the forces to go home. Of course, Villa's legend continues to grow, and he and Carranza and then Zapata enters the scene as well, and the sort of Mexican revolutionary internal fight continues. On the U.S. front, in terms of, the other thing is, I mean, we mentioned Pershing leaves this, and it's just like a year or so, or maybe less than a year or so later, he's on the front in Europe, and World War I has just taken over. And so I'm curious, kind of like, obviously there were colonial ambitions as a through line to World War I, but also I felt like you read this and you read these moments where we're going into Mexico, going into Haiti, and then it feels like, well, World War I comes along and it maybe sort of scratches that itch for like the U.S. to be a world power, to be on the stage, mixing it up, militarily, and maybe it just kind of like came along and gave a little clarity to all of these ambitions that we were talking about.
There certainly is a way that in this period the U.S. is distracted from its continued misadventures in Latin America. I mean, they do pick up throughout the 1920s and into the 1930s. The U.S. just sees its involvement in Latin and South America as different from what it's doing in places like Europe, or even what it's doing in places like the Philippines, which is another place where it is in some ways fighting a low-level war of attrition against a Filipino rebellion against U.S. occupation there.
Pershing comes back from this expedition, but of course, the Civil War in Mexico continues.
Yeah, if you center the story back in Mexico, then you can see that this is a period of revolution and upheaval and leadership changes. And so many of the people that we've talked about, including Carranza, Emilio Zapata, and eventually Pancho Villa himself, are assassinated as part of what is a really tumultuous and violent time in Mexico as it goes through this revolutionary phase before it sets up its new government.
All right. Well, we will leave it there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you.
Thanks, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Support for This Day in Esoteric Political History comes from Odoo. What is Odoo? Well, Odoo is an all-in-one management software with apps for every business need. Odoo has apps for CRM, accounting, sales, HR, inventory, manufacturing, and everything in between. And they're all in one easy-to-use software. And the best part about Odoo? All Odoo apps are integrated, helping you get things done faster and more efficiently. So, when you think about business, think Odoo. To learn more, visit odoo.com/thisday. That's ODOO.com/thisday.
Radiotopia. From